This is a caffeinated risk espresso shot.
On a cynical day, like catch me on a Monday morning, I was like, you can't use the words threat, risk, and vulnerability interchangeably. They do not mean the same thing.
Right.
Here's a picture to prove I'm not the guy. And by the way, the open group agrees with them. But on a happier day, let's explore this part of the infographic. And I think that's the part that we often don't hear a lot about. And you really got to dig into the archives of what you and the other Jack have written over the years. And there's a ton for those that haven't. Go research these guys. They have written it all. And, I've found pieces where one of you, and I forget who, sorry, evaluate your threat community size this way. Mm-hmm. And you can evaluate the motivation of an attacker based on X. And, it suddenly seems very simple. When I break the whole big problem down into a little bitty bite-sized chunk, I'm mostly worried about whether they think they would get away with it or not as my main likelihood indicator.
Right.
I can measure that mentally very quickly. And now I'm okay with my risk decision. I think by breaking it down into factors, you change the game for everyone. I'm not sure everybody's adopting that approach, but I literally will walk down the tree until I get to what's the real thing I'm trying to answer here.
Okay, well, you're a good student of FAIR then, because that's really the idea is to decompose these abstract variables down into measurable components, and then sort of test your own assumptions about them, and find where there's disagreement or where there's assumption. And I apply this in my own personal life all the time about decisions we're making, and this is an unknown factor, but I'm willing to do this, and I'm willing to accept the loss here and do there. I mean, this is how most people operate. I just sort of have a more structured approach to it because of the discipline I put around this for risk and for FAIR. The other interesting thing about this, especially with respect to threat, is I used to call it the event funnel. And, you would sort of you would gather this internal data, and there's, depending on the size of your organization, hundreds or thousands of events a day. And then somewhere at the bottom of this funnel shakes out an actual loss event. And so there's a couple different variables you traverse in the FAIR taxonomy before you get to that loss event. And it was very difficult to programmatically apply values there. So what I would do instead is sort of use those as informative, and then look at that history and then sort of estimate those variables up. So it wasn't exactly computed, it was sort of estimated that way. And then this notion of left and right of boom sort of comes into play too, which is we didn't invent it in risk as far as I can tell. I think it came out of the threat community as I started thinking about these things. And I use this metaphor a lot with people, and it's one of those metaphors that really sort of ages you depending on if you recognize the characters in play or not. But I always use the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner scenario there. So there was always some sort of TNT in play on in these cartoons. And,
made by Acme.
Yep.
That's right. Acme Corp. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And it was always attached to some sort of plunger, right? These are 40-year-old cartoons, probably more now, but a lot of the conceit of the cartoons was about the ways that this plunger would be depressed. Either the coyote would press them, or a rock would fall on them, or whatever. And what you sort of learned is that there's a lot of ways that plunger can be pressed, but when it's pressed, the explosion looks fairly similar every single time. So there's a sort of emergent behavior in this event funnel that I've recognized over the years, which is there are numerous ways that these things can play out. Numerous ways, and there's really great, well-done taxonomies of ways that people can get in and the controls to defend against them. I think that's really valuable. But at an enterprise risk level, and an operational risk level, when you start looking at these sort of things, the explosions can be kind of narrowed down to, regardless of source, for explosions of this type, and that's an important distinction, they're going to have a fairly reasonable range here. And once you start looking at it that way, I found that I need less and less to go down in the taxonomy. It's important to understand that and to have those connections to those kind of things. Mm-hmm. But those risk triggers, which is the word I learned that they use in enterprise risk, those risk triggers, those things that happen that cause a hack or a ransomware event or an IT outage to happen. Those things are numerous. And while it's important to track them and to defend against them, it's almost equally as important to align them to the different types of loss that you will have in those risk scenarios, so that you can do a number of things, such as justifying costs to prevent them, and then sort of looking at frequencies of those types of events cumulatively. So that's sort of an interesting perspective where I think I've changed a little bit from my initial penchant to always sort of decompose first and then roll up. When you start looking at these things, and especially these public data sets, you're like, well, these are already organizations that have had controls in place and still had an event. And the really depressing thing, or not depressing, depending on your point of view here, is that when you start looking at these frequencies, especially around like industry codes, so for companies in this industry code cumulatively, the public events that we know about, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but the public events we know about are rather infrequent. So there are things that you hear a lot of because they're headline grabbing news, but it can be a bit of a vacuum of data around any one company for looking for that kind of thing. So when you start looking at that perspective, and this is why it's difficult, I think, for people in enterprises to say, okay, let's just gather up all the event data that we have. And you go back a couple of years and you think about all the people that have that institutional knowledge about things that have happened. For most organizations, it's pretty sparse. You don't see a whole lot. Or there's one event, but it was under very specific circumstances that no longer exist, and these other sort of things. But that's an important way to think about it too, is that there's exemplars that can be leveraged to that map fairly well to your organization. So anyway, that's sort of where my thinking has been going recently, is as valuable as that decomposition is, and this is a good tool to help sort of check against these aggregate values of here's what we think frequency and loss looks like if we're just using those top two variables. And this is where that comparison of your internal estimates versus the industry ones might be useful for you to sort of provide check and balance of those things.
Yeah, if you can already articulate how bad it's going to be because it's happened in other places, you don't need to drill down. You need to now just assess one side of it or the other. And I think that's
right.
That's important for people to understand. And on the worker bee side, it takes time to do these risks or risk analysis. So,
for sure.
If you don't have to spend an extra 2 weeks getting to the rest of it, I think about the only time I might consider that is if somebody challenges that and like, I don't think that's the right number. Great. Well,
right. Yes.
If you would like to fund it, we can certainly go further down the rabbit hole.
I used to always say that when somebody disagrees with you, you have engagement at that point, and that's when they're buying into the numbers at that point, which is really a great milestone in your cyber risk quantification journey, is when people start to actually challenge them. I think the worst thing that can happen is they just ignore them. It's like, oh, that's great. Anyway, next slide.